Hyper-minimalism is the default. Obviously, my perception on video games as a medium may be very different to yours. I'm someone that cares deeply about it and eventually wants to help make video games for a studio. To many people, when they see this or this, they don't think much of it. It has become a staple of the medium, especially recently to create large open levels, and to promote accessibility in these levels, they use GUI as much as possible, often multiple times to display the same information, to get a player from point A to point B, even at the cost of creativity. Instead of having the level designers craft something internally navigable and readable by default, the easier thing to do is to just slap GUI elements on it everywhere. In my eyes, in my personal view, many games should strive to do as little GUI as they can, because it forces them to actually come up with in-game notions for what the player needs to recognize or where they need to go. Teaching your players how to navigate your world by designing your own logical language throughout the game is far better to me than just slapping a symbol on everything and using text to explain to the player exactly what they need to do all the time. The former option increases immersion, and for me personally, it gives your work much more value due to its thoughtfulness. People will notice that you put work into this. Now, this video is sort of about two things. It's about the necessity of UI, but also about the art within the design of that UI. If I wanted to, I could make an entire video on the overabundance of maps and markers in video games. I could go in depth on the examples I showed before, but I more so want to talk about the artistic aspect in this video, especially when it comes to merging the UI elements with the game world they inhabit. But to touch a little on the application of GUI, like waypoint markers or UI like maps and stuff, I don't want to say there is any perfectly correct way to do it. Is a map with markers on it necessarily bad? Absolutely not. But is it appropriate for a specific game? That depends. My favorite games have maps. Fallout has a map that I quite like a lot because it only displays locations, and the style of the map makes sense in the context of the game world. On the other hand, Arkham has a map that I have issues with a lot, not because they are ugly, but because, like Assassin's Creed or Far Cry, it displays a billion side missions and collectibles that I just don't care for seeing. But what I am talking about there is more so game design in general. The game design of collectibles, side missions, and stuff like that informed what the GUI and UI would be in the final product. I really want to talk about the artistic aspect of these elements, not necessarily the game design elements. Certainly some games like MMORPGs can't always afford to try this hard on GUI design. Multiplayer games are generally more commercial than their single player counterparts. The accessibility notion is gonna absolutely triumph over any artistic elements in the game. But obviously it's a spectrum. The hyper-minimalist typography and graphic design of Valorant is clearly different to that of Fortnite. My point is that the user interface is something many gamers should pay attention to and is very much a part of the artistic design of a video game. It is often the first thing I notice in a game. UI is the ultimate first impression for me, and it often seems like studios don't care enough, or at least as much as they should. I want people to open their eyes a bit more. This doesn't just apply to UI design either, like I said. Look, a HUD map has been a staple of the FPS and exploration game genre for a long time, but this does not mean a map is necessary for an FPS or an open world game. It just means it is one of the easiest options to solve a common problem in that genre. If you're in design that deals with solving problems by delivering information to the consumer/viewer, and you want to stand out, solve the problem in a way other people have less or haven't at all yet. Go the extra mile. People will notice there isn't just one alternative to every problem. Look, Hyper-minimalism is the default. It is basically the basis for all of the user interactive experiences of every big corporation you can think of. It is the basis for their graphic design, for their marketing. It is basically a no-brainer. You cannot escape hyper-minimalism. And this has been an ongoing trend. I'm sure many people have seen the evolution of sort of detailed logos that turn into these super hyper-minimalist versions of themselves. You know, Firefox used to have a fox in its logo, now it's a flaming ball of magma or something. In no way am I saying that hyper-minimalism as a concept is not good. It absolutely can be when focused on, but unfortunately, hyper-minimalism is the easiest, so consequently it often gets the laziest results. Many games I love have minimalist GUI elements that I don't hate, that do their job and sometimes avoid being noticed. What's important is making sure the UI doesn't look like factory default. It has to be clear that thought went into it, and if it isn't a part of the artistic expression of the game, then the job of the UI is to get out of the player's way as much as possible. Right, so let's talk about some examples of UI that I really like. The first one is gonna be extremely obvious, Batman Arkham Asylum. I think viewers on my channel just know I'll bring up this game in like 50% of my videos. The GUI of Arkham Asylum is not necessarily designed to be unnoticed. It draws attention to itself, but not like in a bad way. I feel like it's super important to point out that UI elements only show up when you actually need them, like whenever you're in combat or you're switching to a different gadget. But as soon as you don't need those things, if you're just exploring the map, the HUD will entirely disappear, which I think is huge, that more games need to do this, because an entirely empty HUD is one of my favorite things ever. And it can work for games with HUDs, just have the HUD fade away when you don't necessarily need it. It's obvious that the comic book ink art style of the UI fits the game. I mean, it's Batman, obviously. This has some minimalist elements to it, but like the next example I'll bring up, it combines the grimy yet fantastical tone of the game quite well. I especially like that often the elements aren't even oriented perfectly. You can see imperfections in the inking, and the maps have markings of blueprints and stuff. This is intentional imperfection and texture that perfectly matches Arkham Asylum to me. The game taking the characters of the animated series into a darker, more serious tone completely parallels the UI having a comic booky sense of nostalgia while also being rushed and grimy looking. One last thing I want to point out with Arkham Asylum is one of the few instances of diegetic UI in the game, the cryptographic sequencer, which I think could be considered GUI but exists in the world itself. In immersive simulation games, diegetic UI is quite important, and that's sort of what these examples are leading up to. So in terms of art style, Dishonored 2 might have done a similar idea even better than Arkham Asylum. The game has UI design that I would say is somewhat minimalist, and if not minimalist then at least extremely consistent and clean, but is heavily influenced by the art style of the world it inhabits. All of the different typefaces used in the menus and GUI and UI can actually be found in the world itself, usually on like posters and signs. All of the different menus and UI elements are simple and readable, but have a ton of texture and depth to them. It's extremely obvious that the designer spent tons of time on it. Both the UI and GUI and the world that it inhabits have a painterly, fantastical, but Art Deco tone to them. You know, the game has you uncovering detailed journals and documented experiments of crazy scientists and alchemists, so it makes so much sense that the UI is designed like the notations of a scientist, with bullet points, tabs, and small little illustrations of different subjects. I mean, every time you beat a level, it gives you a graph that calculates your stealth over lethality. Alien Isolation. Do I even need to explain this one? I mean, the tone, the atmosphere, and design of the world is a perfect adaptation and evolution of the films, and the user interface is not excluded. Most of the GUI you can interact with in this game is diegetic, meaning it exists in the world itself, like the cryptographic sequencer. The UI is basically, in a meta sense, an extension of the fictional UI created for all the computers and tech in this retro-futuristic universe. And I love that. That was a crazy sentence, but I fucking love that. I just love that the UI of hacking, of terminals, of your radar, of circuit breakers, etc. are all in the game world itself, and you can literally move your head while interacting with it. Now, unfortunately, not all of the UI in the game is like this. The crafting system is in a pause menu, which is not in the game world, and same for the map. And I really feel like there was a missed opportunity with the heads-up display. I appreciate that very little is on the HUD itself, but I really wish they went the extra mile and gave the ammo and health information to the player diegetically. Dead Space did this with the health by having it be a bar on the back of your character at all times. Alien Isolation is a deeply immersive game, and I think having no HUD at all would have helped that vastly. Still, the UI design of Alien Isolation is some of the best I have seen in the AAA space personally, although I am somewhat biased since I love retro-futuristic tech so much. The last game I want to talk about is one that hasn't even come out yet, so I hope that what I say is somewhat accurate to what it actually ends up being. Routine is a very cryptic game that has been in and out of development since 2012, a decade ago. This is a game that was seemingly ahead of its time, doing stuff similar to Alien Isolation before it even came out. So I think I will like this game for the same reasons I love Alien Isolation. I adore dark retro-futurism, a horrific twist on what used to be considered utopian. I love film grain, post-process effects, and, stuff that gives the visuals more character and provide the intent of imperfection. I love being immersed in the game world as much as possible. So I'm going to take an educated guess and assume that the goal for this game is immersion by having little to no non-diegetic UI in the game besides possibly a pause menu and probably a main menu. Every bit of the gameplay we have seen shows practically no HUD beyond a small dot for aiming in the newest gameplay. In a similar fashion to the hacking device or radar of Alien Isolation, you will be carrying around a gun that also displays UI information. Even more interesting, probably the most interesting part of this game, or at least what we've seen so far, is how important terminals are. A step further from Alien Isolation, you are not locked in position when interacting with terminals. I don't know the full context yet, but it appears that terminals and screens throughout the map are in place of menus and button prompts. I wouldn't be surprised if the pause and save menu is literally in the world itself on one of these screens. Routine is taking diegetic UI to the next level, and I'm absolutely ready for it. So in conclusion, I think an overall idea you can take from this video is that I believe that intention adds value to art. Sometimes they are one and the same. When I can look at all the different elements in a game and see that there was intent behind each of them, it makes me feel like my time is worth giving to the game because I know a lot of time was put into making it. Intent follows truth. I want to feel like the creator of whatever I am interacting with cares about it, cares about the creation. When I see cut corners, ignored elements, and a lack of intent, factory default UI, it's harder to believe that truth. So in summary, I want to know that a human being made this game.